You're good.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out here today. I also want to thank our visitors who are watching online. I hope they're enjoying their coffee and their breakfast in their pajamas. But let me tell you, you're missing Starbucks and a fabulous breakfast buffet here. We have a wonderful crowd who have braved the weather to come out here this morning for this conference on Caught in the Crossfire, providing education during armed conflict. This is part of what the American Red Cross does. We focus on how we can uphold and advance the Geneva Conventions, also known as the laws of war, and they form the main body of international humanitarian law. And that is at the heart of the mission of the American Red Cross and our sister and brother organizations around the world, other Red Crosses, Red Crescents, ICRC, and the International Federation. Today, we have assembled a wonderful team of experts to focus on the importance of education and how to make it both life-saving and a means of protection during an armed conflict, keeping children safe when they are caught in the crossfire. Recently, schools and students have become direct targets during armed conflict and war. We see that from young boys who are recruited as child soldiers in school to girls who are abducted from their schools, prevented from getting education, and are also misused and abused by armed groups and exploited in many ways by those who were combatants. Education during conflict and emergencies is life-sustaining for children, offering them a protective environment and also promoting the ideals of tolerance and peace when they are tested to the extreme. Millions of children, however, are out of school as a result of armed conflict. We've seen places such as Gaza where there are still children and families living inside schools that can't be used for providing education due to the lack of shelter. So how do we approach such a difficult and complex topic? And I'm glad to say that we have a really amazing panel of experts here this morning to help us explore these issues and how each of us might take on a role to strengthen protection and education during wartime. Dean Brooks is the director of the International Network for Education and Emergencies. And I'll be shortly turning over the microphone to him. You will also see at our website, lawsofarmedconflict.com, a link to a wonderful interview that he did on YouTube for us in the lead up to this conference. So after this conference, we want to go back and watch that interview again. We also have with us Ana Azarieva Valente, an educational specialist from UNICEF headquarters who focuses on peace building, education, and advocacy. Zainab Korsim-Neff is the Executive Director of the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, and we're delighted to have her here today. Dia Najawid is the Director of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. She oversees management of all the coalition's operations, including program implementation, human resources, and financial resources. Nina Papadopoulos is the Senior Technical Field Advisor and the U.S. Agency for International Development Education Team. She's a 15-year veteran of promoting the right of education in conflict and crisis. And she has a tremendous wealth of experience to bring to this discussion today. Finally, we have Jennifer Sklar, the Senior Education Technical Advisor for the International Rescue Committee, with more than 13 years of experience working in the field. So you're going to hear people not just talk about this issue, but related to their past experience in current conflicts they're taking part in the world. Again, I encourage you to take part through the webcast at lawsofarmedconflict.com. We're thankful to those of you who have tuned in. Also, please participate online through the hashtag #EdDuringConflict, all one word. With that, let me thank again all the people who are here today. I wish I could pan out the camera and show you the room here. You would be amazed. We probably have about a good, I would say 40, maybe even 50 people here who've come today for this event, despite some pretty abysmal weather outdoors. So with that, let me please turn over the podium to Dean Brooks. And Dean, thank you very much for taking part today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you to all of you online who are watching. As mentioned, my name is Dean Brooks. I'm from the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, and I'm here today to talk with you and my colleagues about this topic of children and youth caught in the crossfire. I'd like to start my talk actually 2014, there was in 26 countries. Number of refugees is at its highest level since World War II. There are 51.2 million refugees and internally displaced persons in the world today, the highest number of forcibly displaced persons ever recorded. And among the many millions of refugee children and adolescents, over 1/3 are out of school with no hopes of ever returning to the classroom. If education is viewed as only a development issue and not included as part of the first-line humanitarian response, then we are denying millions of children the right to an education. Girls account for only 30% of the refugees enrolled in secondary schools. Globally, there are an estimated 58 million children of primary school age, this is just primary school, who are out of school overall. But 50% of those children live in conflict-affected areas. It's not only conflict, though, it's also natural hazards and disasters. Natural disasters killed more than 1 million people and affected 1/4 of the global population since 2000. Over 1/3 of those are children and youth. Additionally, we don't talk about this so often, but violence is affecting the right to education. We're seeing this in Latin America with gang violence, school violence, drug-related violence on the rise. For example, in Brazil, 84% of students from 6 state capitals consider their school to be violent. In El Salvador, 7 in 10 children make it to high school, but of that 7, only 4 graduate, and the main reason is they have to drop out because of gang violence. A really important point, and I think we need to really look at this closely, is that when we look back in the 1990s, a refugee was displaced for, on average, 9 years. Today, that number is 17 years. That's the length of a child's entire education. With the average conflict lasting 10 years and families remaining in refugee camps for 17 years on average, the failure to prioritize education renders an entire generation uneducated, disadvantaged, and unprepared to contribute to their society's recovery. In addition, there's not a lot of attention to education. When we look at the numbers, just yesterday I heard that it was 1% of humanitarian aid, or 1.95 is the number they're talking about. It's going back and forth, but it's less than 2% of humanitarian assistance going to education. But at the same time that I've painted for you this very bright picture, not at all, I would say that we've also seen some incredible developments in terms of the field of education and emergencies. So since the early 1990s, this has come on the agenda. More and more people interested in education and emergencies. You here at the Red Cross have asked for this event. You want to learn more. We're seeing more interest. Some key events that have happened. I mentioned earlier, the establishment of the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies. Later, INED developed minimum standards for education and emergencies. Very much connected to, I know many of you are aware of the SPEARS minimum standards for emergencies. There's been a greater focus on education and emergencies, such as the General Assembly resolution calling for the right to education in emergencies. We've seen the global community organize a reform process and recognize that education should be a cluster as part of the UN IASC cluster system for humanitarian response. And education is now a recognized cluster. We have organizations like the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. All of these have risen up throughout the last decade. But we have much more to do. I'd like to turn my talk now to something very important, and that is why education emergencies. And actually, just a very quick anecdote. I was actually on a plane to respond to the Somalia situation, and sitting next to somebody, and they asked me, why do you do this? You know, you've been doing this for many years, and what is education in emergencies? And I remember thinking, why do I do this? It's not very easy. It's actually heartbreaking at times. And you know, I gave the answers similar to the answers I'm giving you now, but I left that conversation thinking about it. And I still think about it. And you know what it really boils down to for me personally? It's about hope. And it's about a situation where people are powerless, you're giving back power. People can do something about their lives. And that's why education emergencies. But I also want to talk to you about, you know, the framework for why education emergencies. First of all, one of our arguments is that education can save lives because it provides physical protection. Protection from exploitation, crisis environment. When a child is in a safe learning environment, she or he is less likely to be sexually or economically exploited or exposed to other risks, such as recruitment into fighting groups or organized crime. That never became more real to me than when I remember being in Guinea many years ago. A group of adolescents came up to me as I was walking to a school, and they said, can we please go to school? If we have a school uniform, they're not going to pick us up and make us go into the army. I never thought about that before like that. I used to think kids shouldn't have school uniforms. They should be free to wear what they want. And I realized schools actually, and the semblance of it, and the uniforms, and the material, all of that helps to protect children. Education provides psychological and cognitive protection. It provides a sense of normalcy, stability, structure, and hope for the future. That gets back to my point earlier. Providing education gives back power. Education sustains life by offering safe spaces for learning. In the midst of a conflict when families are trying to get their lives back together, trying to find a home or create a living space in a camp or in an urban setting, a school provides that sense of normalcy, and it helps to create safety. I've seen this happen in Darfur, where we set up child-friendly spaces, and the mothers can put their children in these centers, and then they can go back and organize their homes in this very tumultuous situation. Education also unleashes innovation and entrepreneurial skills. They're important for economic activity and job creation. Elements critical for stability during times of reconstruction and for longer-term sustainable development. This is also true for refugees and internally displaced people. If they receive a quality education while in exile, they are more likely to develop the skills they need to make use of the existing economic, social, and political systems upon returning home. Wars, complex emergencies, and natural disasters disrupt education. And with the prolonged delays in restarting, this result is generations denied the knowledge and opportunities that an education can provide. Education for prevention, preparedness, and in response and in recovery must be seen in a broad context, because it is education that protects the well-being, fosters learning opportunities, and nurtures the overall development, social, emotional, cognitive, and physical, of children and youth affected by conflicts, disasters, violence. There's one last point about why educational emergencies, and I think it's very important, and that's because communities, those most affected, prioritize it. I would say that almost in every situation where I have been soon after an emergency, after the tsunami, during the Darfur crisis, West Africa, when I've arrived and it's just started, just a few days after, I find teachers self-organizing. I find parents organizing classes and putting their children in school. Maybe it's not the recognized formal system, but again and again and again, you will find that. And I would say most aid workers, first-line responders say the same. Affected communities are often the first to establish schools, learning spaces, and non-formal education. The challenge is it is difficult to maintain this for a long time. So the point is that during situations of response, there are opportunities to support that. And often, and I would say that to any new person going into the field, look around you and you'll find it's already on the ground. Build on that, strengthen that, support that. Another point that I want to talk about, and we're going to talk about a little bit more after we finish this time with our panel, is conflict-sensitive education. And this is something that IME has developed many tools and resources. There's a video that we'll be posting online for those who are able to watch us online, and you can link to that. I think it's already been on the Twitter feed. But conflict-sensitive education gets at the point that not only is access to education important, but so is quality. And when we provide education, we must follow the principles of do no harm. So conflict-sensitive education is this kind of sphere of response that we're starting to see at its root is around do no harm. And the reason is education has the power to mitigate conflict, but it also has the ability to increase tensions and conflict. For example, education was actively used to incite ethnic hatred when we look at Rwanda, and it contributed to the 1994 genocide. In Liberia, the long-term mass exclusion of indigenous children from formal education contributed to the outbreak of violence in 1999. Later, UNICEF is going to talk to us a bit about conflict-sensitive education and explain in more detail the importance of how this works, mapping out all the drivers of conflict, looking for ways to respond. The next thing I would like to share with you is an important development that we've also seen, which is called Education Cannot Wait. And we will also be framing our discussion with the panel around some of the priorities from this initiative. Many of you might have heard, but September 26, 2012, the UN Secretary General launched the Global Education First initiative. Many of you might be members and partners of that. I'd like to read for you the Secretary General's quote. It's quite poignant, I believe, when he first launched this initiative. This is what he said. Growing up in the Republic of Korea as I recovered from war, I had few school supplies and studied in the open air. People today often ask about my country's transformation from poverty to prosperity. Without hesitation, I answer that education was the key. In almost all my visits to areas ravaged by war and disaster, the plea of survivors is the same: education first. Education helps to reestablish normalcy for traumatized children and sets the stage for lasting stability. We must answer this legitimate request. We cannot afford to waste the talents of a generation. We must provide safe learning environments, textbooks, support for parents, transportation to school, and training for teachers. When this was launched, supported this, the Education in Emergencies community came together and developed the Education Cannot Wait, a call to action created to ensure adequate funding in emergencies, protection of education from attack, and emergency-sided education sector plans. Given this development, IME organized an advocacy working group which continues to this day. In conclusion, the effort to meet the education rights and needs of learners affected by crisis requires the engagement of the global community, the creativity, knowledge, and energy of those working within a range of disciplines, from technology, peace building, sustainable development, law, the public sector, and many others. I am grateful to have the opportunity today to call attention to this urgent issue and to start a conversation with all of you in the room and those of you online. Together, we can address this global challenge. I want to close with words from those who are affected most. Recently, IME held a global competition. We asked young people, children, youth, young adults to tell us why education in emergencies is important. We hope to be launching a book of those quotes very soon. But two very interesting quotes that I'd like to leave you with. The first comes from Mexican Desiree, 21 years old, from the Ivory Coast, who had to flee to Liberia. And this is what he said about education. I arrived in Liberia in despair and was left destitute and traumatized. I had lost everything. Worried, we young Ivorian refugees approached humanitarian NGOs because we desperately wanted to avoid losing more years of schooling. In reality, we had lost everything: our house, our belongings, and our chances in education. So to be able to benefit from the education provided by the NGO gave us the opportunity to mend our desperate, lost, and hopeless heart. Thus, access to education during emergencies allowed us to be equals to people of our own age who live in peace. And lastly, a young woman named Charlotte, who was 14 years old, who had survived Typhoon Haiyan, also known as Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines. This is what she said: I am so thankful that my fellow classmates and my teacher are still alive. Even our clothes are gone, our notebooks are wet, but we still went to school because we want to learn. We want to be educated. Thank you very much, and we're going to take a short break. We're going to go to a panel discussion and continue this discussion. Thank you. So we can come on. Okay. For this, yeah. Yeah. Well, I can see if somebody has them. Or I can look at them online. I have them online.
I was told I could.
So that's the coffee on the table, but for beverages, you want to keep them.
Looks like it's yeah. Yeah. Welcome back. Welcome back. Is the microphone on?
I think so.
Okay. I hope everybody had their coffee, and those of you at home had your coffee as well. So we're back now. We're going to do a bit of a discussion. All of the panelists that were introduced earlier are here. And my first question, and we'll also be taking questions from the audience. Yes? Okay.
Let's make sure.
How about now? Testing? Good. So I just said hello and welcome back. You didn't hear that. So the first question I have will also be receiving questions from those of you online. But the first question is for Jennifer Sklar from IRC and Anya from UNICEF. What are the organizations and practitioners on the ground doing to ensure that education is still accessible for children and youth during conflict?
Hi, it's a real pleasure to be here. So maybe I'll just talk about one or two aspects of implementing education that's specific to sort of conflict or crisis. For IRC, we have two pretty straightforward outcomes that we seek for children in conflict and crisis that probably cut across a lot of agencies. One is simply equitable access to sort of safe, effective, responsive education services. The other is learning, and similar to other organizations, a focus on those foundational skills of literacy and numeracy, as well as social emotional learning, or what people call soft skills, life skills, psychosocial support. So maybe I'll just tackle a few elements of each of those two outcomes. One around access. A lot of people have talked about that, children are going to school in a lot of these low income or developing contexts and not learning. And so, access is a means towards an end, that you must care about learning. And I definitely agree with that. But I would say also in sort of conflict and crisis, there's a lot of research that shows it can be an end of itself from a sort of protection perspective. That, research shows that for children to sort of recover from trauma and for their mental health and sort of their distress and depression and, the kind of effects conflict has on them, that sort of stability, predictability, structure really makes a difference in terms of their recovery from trauma. And we know that schools really do provide that. So I think it's a worthy goal in and of itself to sort of reestablish schools and safe learning spaces in crisis. It's very important that they learn, but it's also an important goal in and of itself. The other around access is, we know that a person is a refugee on average for 17 years. And we know that governments often, have a lot of challenges absorbing children into their education system, or they have, a decade later don't have the resources to reach kids, or there are differences in curriculum. And so on the ground, there's a lot of focus on both supporting formal government structures to absorb additional kids, which is very important, and also looking at alternative non-formal education. And often that's easier said than done. Often, people want to say it's a humanitarian crisis, so let's go and implement, a non-formal learning space. Or people say, okay, the conflict it's protracted in its early recovery, let's invest in formal education systems, and let's do that. I think a lot of these terms of humanitarian development or acute crisis or early recovery, no longer sort of serves its purpose in terms of helping children and ensuring they have continued education services. We know that probably all options are needed on the table, that children are going to need, governments are going to need to sort of look at accelerated learning, catch-up, non-formal literacy, as well as absorbing additional children, that given the scale that we need all solutions on the table. And that's often easier said than done. We also know that in terms of access, a lot of families are really affected. Their livelihood is affected, and probably the best evidence out there around supporting families to afford education often centers around cash transfers. And there's evidence around whether it's conditional or unconditional, but supporting families to actually afford education. So that's, I think people focus on sort of looking at ways of delivering education as well as cash transfers. And then just briefly on learning, supporting the foundational skills of math and reading are really important, but we also know that children are really affected by sort of exposure to violence and trauma, and that there are other foundational skills that are sort of disrupted during conflict. Their ability to focus, manage their emotions, self-regulate, have trust in adults, have trust in each other, being able to sort of resolve conflict peacefully, that a lot of these sort of social and cognition processes are really affected, and that really affects their ability to learn and have healthy relationships. A lot of their sort of self-esteem and sense of control and ability to say, here's my goal and I can achieve it, is affected, and that affects their ability to persist in school. Focusing on sort of academic subjects is very important, but also focusing on these other, what people call soft skills. It's not so soft. They're also extremely important and necessary for children to be able to learn and, more importantly, persist in school. And there's a lot of sort of evidence around the importance of that in terms of achieving academic success.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very good to be here, and thank you for hosting us here on this snowy day. As a Russian, I'm secretly very excited about the view from the window. But turning to this important topic, just to highlight, the challenge really is immense. UNICEF called 2014 a devastating year for children, for the number of children that have actually been caught up in armed conflict. Just to get a picture, more than 1 in 10 world's children is currently living in countries or areas that are affected by armed conflict. That's about 230 million children. So the challenge is really vast. Also recognizing the cyclical nature of conflict, and recognizing that evidence that shows that about half of conflicts will relapse back within the next 5 to 10 years. The systems, governments, international organizations are put in the position where they really need to change the way they deliver for children in these circumstances. And what does this mean in terms of education? In addition to the direct response that Jennifer has just talked about, a lot more emphasis has been recently placed on planning processes. And we know that in a lot of conflict-affected countries, including from those that went through cycles and cycles of violence and conflict, education systems were not necessarily able to either prevent or withstand or bounce back. And the education sector plans were largely blind to the issues of emergency and conflict. So recognizing that's a huge area of challenge, UNICEF and partners and practitioners on the ground work with governments to specifically plan for prevention, for preparedness, for response, and for recovery. And what does this really mean in practice? For example, through the education clusters, we work with governments to support the strategic response planning on the ground. That means prioritizing the immediate needs, setting targets, and also costing those. UNICEF is a global lead on the post-disaster and the post-conflict needs assessment, which is also then used to prioritize the action. We're very heavily invested in the capacity building at all levels, at the government at all levels, but also in terms of partners and UNICEF itself, for the education to all affected populations, but secondly, invest in the longer-term resilience of the education systems that can contribute to a cohesive society. We are engaged in the significant upstream work on the conflict and disaster risk reduction in education policies and planning. This is a very important area of work. As an example, it's really critical that all the planning cycle really is sensitive to conflict. From the education sector diagnostic into the planning for the education sector plan, into the budgeting processes, into the implementation, into the intermediate reviews, and so forth. Just very recently, last year, both the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Chad, for the first time, included conflict-specific chapters in the education sector diagnostic. That's not something that has been routinely done. It's not been a part of the global methodology for such diagnostics. So there's been a significant step, because currently the new education sector plans that are being informed by those education sector diagnostics are then drawing some of that knowledge into the planning. So that's a big step. We support the early warning systems, and then at the school and the community level, obviously we engage systematically in school management plans, in protecting education from attack, and advocacy basically at the community level for the importance of education. As a result of these efforts, we see significantly many more countries informing their education sector plans, including preparedness measures and so forth. In the recent South Sudan, they have specifically referred to the INE minimum standards, which is a huge step, and identified for specific actions for emergencies. We know that DRC, Cote d'Ivoire, Pakistan, Sierra Leone, Somalia, Yemen, all have addressed the conflict considerations in the education sector plans through the work that has been done over the last 2-3 years. So that's a significant step. For UNICEF in 2013 alone, about 3.6 million children from early childhood into adolescence have access to safe education opportunities as a result of these collaborative efforts. We also know that education is the first priority identified by communities and families in crisis. And the recent council for my work with the post-2015 agenda actually showed that education was identified as the first priority through surveys that took about 850,000 people. And yet we know that the funding streams do not respond to what communities and parents want for themselves. For education specifically, we've experienced yet another drop. About 1.5% of the global humanitarian funding is currently going to the education. That's another drop from already quite a low number of 1.5% last year. So that's alarming. So the last beat of this work is obviously advocacy at the global level and at the national level to prioritize education as communities and parents do.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn the question now over to the right. To Zayma and Dia. My question is, many schools and students have become a direct target during the conflict. Go ahead.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this subject here today. First of all, we need to recognise that there's not one sort of side to every situation where attacks occur. We need to be very cognizant of the context of why the attacks take place, what the conflict dynamics are, what the community dynamics are, the risk factors, and from that we need to tailor a response to the particular circumstances. So first of all, we need to think about why are schools, students and school staff being targeted for attack in situations of armed conflict. I think the reason that we're most familiar with is ideological, where groups oppose the education of girls, or they consider education to be Western, and they think that it is transmitting values that they oppose. But education is also attacked because schools are seen as state institutions, teachers are seen as state employees, so they're soft, easy targets for anti-government forces. Schools are much easier to bomb than a military installation. Teachers are easier to kill than a soldier. Also, as has been mentioned earlier, children are recruited to be soldiers from schools, and obviously that's a prime location where you can get a hold of children for these purposes, so that's another reason for attack. And also, education is deemed as mentioning can be a real trigger for conflict. For example, if schools are only accessible or are better accessible to certain populations and at the expense of other populations, or the resources given to one set of schools is so much better than other schools, that creates conflict within a community. And also the curriculum favors the language, the religion, the history of a particular group while completely ignoring or diminishing the culture of another group. That's another driver of conflict. And then finally, schools are used for military purposes, as bases, as barracks, as detention centers, and this puts the school at risk of attack by opposing forces as well. So those are some of the factors to think about when you're trying to develop a strategy for protecting education. But there are some sort of measures we can apply across the board. And one of these is strengthening monitoring and reporting of attacks on education. We need to know where attacks are occurring, what the incidence is of these attacks, and why. And from that, we can better inform our policy and planning responses. For example, if we know how many schools have been destroyed or damaged, that will better enable us to know how to rebuild those schools, how to rehabilitate them. A second thing that we need to do is strengthen the accountability measures. Under international law, humanitarian law, human rights law, there are excellent protections for education. The problem is implementation. It's very poor, and impunity for perpetrators of attacks is widespread. A third step we need to take is what's being discussed here in some detail, conflict-sensitive planning and policies. We need to ensure that there is equitable access to education, that there's equitable resourcing of education, and that the curriculum does include the language, the culture, the religion of the students that it's representing that are in the schools. We also need to have contingency plans and risk reduction plans, which Anya has just been talking about. We need to make sure that if schools are attacked and children can't go to those schools because they're unsafe, that there are other options for those children. So things like long-distance education or alternative and temporary schools in other locations that are safe. And finally, we really need to ensure that communities are included in the entire process that I've just mentioned, all these different steps and strategies. Because communities are the ones that really understand what the conflict dynamics are, what their own dynamics are, and what resources they have. And so they are the ones who are best placed to tailor a response to their particular circumstances.
And as Dia was mentioning, one risk factor for attacks on schools is the military uses. So if you could maybe address that, please.
Thank you, Dee. Imagine that you're a 13-year-old girl in school in Yemen. Breakaway opposition forces have moved into the 3rd floor of your school. They've constructed concrete blocks along the balconies to protect their floor of the school, not yours. And every day, you now pass armed men in order to enter and leave your school. One day you're at recess, and troops bring in an old man who's a suspect. A 13-year-old girl told Human Rights Watch about this very kind of incident. She said they beat him and electroshocked him right in the courtyard of the school. Now imagine that you're a mother of a girl in a school in southern Thailand where troops move into part of the school campus. A mother in that situation who pulled her daughter out of school told us, "It is more dangerous for girls than boys because girls these days grow up so quickly. I fear that the girls will get pregnant by the soldiers." Like in Yemen, in southern Thailand, in countries around the world, schools are being used for military purposes. The Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack has found that in some 25 countries, 25 conflicts in recent years, schools have been used to house troops, as detention centers, even torture chambers, to store weapons, as sniper posts, used for things that are very dangerous for children. In some cases, schools, children are displaced entirely from schools, and in other instances, like in Yemen and southern Thailand, children are struggling to go to school alongside armed men. As you can imagine, this is very bad for children. Either they are displaced in education, or in the struggle to go to school alongside armed men, they are in a very inappropriate environment for getting an education. The quality suffers. Both teachers and students are more likely to be absent. The quality of teaching goes down. Girls in particular drop out. We've seen in countries around the world. And children's right to education is denied. It's also expensive to use schools as bases and barracks. And according to the education cluster, it costs in South Sudan $67,000 on average to rehabilitate a school used by the SPLA. So countries that may be thinking that they're giving money to support education find that their monies are being used instead to provide bases for warring parties. In addition to it being very inappropriate for children's education, very expensive, using schools for military purposes also places children directly at risk of attack. I'll never forget interviewing students in Somalia, one of whom described to Human Rights Watch what happened to him one day when he was in school in Mogadishu during Ramadan of 2010. He said that Al-Shabaab came into the compound of the school and told us to stay in class. They then, in the playground, set up a surface-to-air rocket launcher and started launching from inside the school compound, while the students and teachers huddled inside their classrooms. He said, we were trapped for 2 hours. There was incoming fire coming back in our direction. 5 rockets hit around the school compound. Finally, Al-Shabaab agreed to let them go, but as they were fleeing, 1 rocket landed and killed 8 students as they were running away. Using schools for military purposes creates a military target and literally places children's and teachers' lives at risk. For this reason, the Security Council has spoken out on this. The UN Security Council has both called on countries to refrain from using schools for military purposes, but also now to take concrete measures to deter the use of schools for military purposes. And we have an idea about how to do that. In the last few years, there has been an extensive process of developing new international guidelines to protect schools and universities from military use. We have an example here, and they're available on the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attacks website. They are a set of clear guidelines. There's 6 guidelines that address not using schools for military purposes, what to do about abandoned schools, what to do if opposing forces are using the school, and what to do to provide school security. They're very short. They're, in fact, drafted both in extensive consultation with states, but initially drafted by an ex-British military officer with 30 years experience. They're designed to be very practically useful to troops in the field. In the last year, Norway and Argentina have stepped forward to take over this process and to champion these guidelines. The guidelines were then finalized in Geneva in December of this year, and Norway and Argentina are planning a formal endorsement event in June of this year where countries will be able to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration and endorse these guidelines that would protect schools and universities from military use. It's a simple idea, but it is a really good idea, and one that I truly believe that if countries then implement these into their own laws and military policies, that we in the future will see many more children protected from having their schools used for military purposes.
Thank you so much. My next question turns to this year, is 2015. Given the expiration of the Millennium Development Goals, Education for All goals, and the increased global focus on education and emergencies, as we talked about earlier, 2015 is an important year. What opportunities does the education community have for advocacy and for actions going forward? I've heard about one. I'd like to address this question to Nina Papadopoulos from the USAID.
Thank
Thank you so much, Dean, and thanks again for having us here. Before I answer your question, Dean, I actually just wanted to thank the young Dean Brooks that was on that plane and all the other colleagues and friends and heroes around the world that are watching this today and that may watch this later for the tireless work that they do on all of our behalf. I really do believe that you know, we are lucky enough to sit up here and we're safe today and our kids are either at home or at school. We can pretty much assume that they're going to be okay. And we have colleagues around the world working in far-reach areas in Liberia, in Somalia, in South Sudan, in Sierra Leone, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and they are risking their lives every day to protect education from attack and to make sure that children and young people get the best chance that they can at a future. So I want to thank you all on behalf of all of us for the work that you do around the world. Now, getting back to your question, Dean, I want to highlight a few key terms that I'm going to discuss when you talk about where we're at, and we are at a critical moment. For better or for worse, the last few years we've seen very challenging situations around the world, particularly for education. There are many champions for this. Malala Yousafzai is one, but as I think our First Lady said the other day when they were launching a new initiative called Let Girls Learn, there are hundreds of Malalas around the world, and this is a moment where we've got this momentum. I think that the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack has done some very important work to highlight these issues. At USAID in the last few years, we've actually prioritized education in these environments. We have one of our 3 strategic goals for our education strategy is to increase equitable access to education. And what's unique about this goal actually is that we have a numerical target. We want to reach 15 million learners. We don't know how long it will take us to reach them. We thought it could take 5 years, but now we're seeing that it may take longer, but we're committed to that goal. And I think that that's important when we talk about what we can do in this area, in this space, for other actors and other donors to really sort of look at numeric targets and make commitments to those. When we talk about the post-2015 agenda, I think, yes, it's critical and it's key, and we're able to look back on what has happened prior to this time. And we really do know that right now, these discussions have the potential to build on the momentum of the MDGs and to serve as a powerful instrument to eradicate extreme poverty within a generation. But we know also that we must focus on transformative priorities that can have wide-reaching and long-standing impact, particularly for the most vulnerable, including conflict and crisis-affected children. These conversations, and when I say these conversations, I mean the ones around the post-2015 agenda, are really pushing all actors to look at the global infrastructure, where and how it's falling short, and engage in a renewed dialogue on how to bridge the gaps in development and humanitarian assistance. I think all donors and actors in this space, particularly at this moment in time, are really looking at the key challenges. You can't ask a child in a refugee camp if they're conflict affected or if they're now in a development setting. You can't do that, and we should really push ourselves to think a little bit differently. To me, you know, some of these key terms that I want to talk to you about: adapt, partner, disrupt, and target. We know that our funding for education in these environments, we need to be a little more creative. We need to be able to adapt. And let me give you an example. In the last few years, particularly in countries like Nigeria and South Sudan, as a donor, USAID has been able to reorient some of its education resources to address the really sort of pressing and current needs of education for children and young people. It's not easy to do. but it's something that we have to push ourselves and look for those opportunities. Partner, we can't do this alone. We work with everybody. We know that the world has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. We need to work with INEE. We need to work with UNICEF. We need to work with all the other partners out there to put our best foot forward and address these challenges head on. Disrupt. It's not business as usual anymore. We do need to look for innovative ways to address these challenges. I think this is really a call to action for all of us. How do we reflect on the way we've been doing this work and do it differently? You can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. Okay? And target. Again, targeting is important. I think we find as a donor, it has really helped us to focus our resources and to make sure that our programs are cost-effective and evidence-based. Targeting helps us to do that. And so I think that if I were to give advice to other actors in this space, don't underestimate the importance of monitoring and evaluating and assessing the impact of your programs. It might be hard to do, but this will help us all to target our resources more effectively.
Thank you. So I think we have some time now for questions from our online viewers. Correct? Okay. Our iPads are working, so we're going to use some comments. So this first question, what is the role of neutral for humanitarians in ensuring that vulnerable people not only receive education, but receive one that does not perpetuate conflict? Is there somebody hold that up? I can read it again. That's what I was thinking. Read this out. I'll read it again real quick. What is the role of neutral humanitarians in ensuring that vulnerable people receive an education that does not perpetuate conflict?
I'm glad this question came up because over the last years, obviously, while on one hand we have been advancing the education and humanitarian action agenda, we have also came to recognize that perhaps there is very little that can be neutral in terms of education and conflict. And aid programs are in conflict areas will either exacerbate some of the conflict factors or help to mitigate them. And so that is the reality and the shift in the thinking that is very important to underline here. And that's true for all phases of conflict, in the midst of conflict, in the post-conflict recovery, in longer term processes. So what does this really mean and how can we ensure that education doesn't exacerbate the existing tensions and helps contribute to building more cohesive societies? First of all, conflict-sensitive design and implementation of both policies and programs is absolutely essential to ensure that on one hand, the education helps address the root causes of violence and conflict, and on the other hand, ensure that education contributes to peace and more equitable access. Now, what does this mean, this conflict-sensitive design? It is much easier said than done, and it's in a sense a buzzword that has been around for the few years recently. And it is really a process. It is a very sensitive process of, first of all, understanding the context in which education is being delivered. And secondly, analyzing the two-way relationship between the education intervention and policy and the context in which this intervention is taking place. And thirdly, actually acting to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts. That involves, as a first step, conflict analysis. Education programs and policies must be informed by in-depth conflict analysis, and we have crossed huge grounds in the last years through the education, peace building and advocacy program in actually developing the methodologies and applying them across very different conflict settings to understand to have a conflict analysis of the education sector. What does it mean to bring education stakeholders to discuss issues that are political like that? And then secondly, once you've got your conflict analysis, it's the broader capacity building. Our education staff well prepared to undertake these issues, and they're well versed to enter the environment that is very sensitive. And thirdly, it's the enabling environment. Very, very often in conflict settings, education is deprioritized. In the peace processes, in the peace building plans, education until very recently has almost never been a priority. And social services until very recently have not been recognized for that transformative power. So the advocacy bit there goes beyond education actually, to make sure that education and other social services is included and is funded as the broader national priorities. Then not place all the onus on the educators in humanitarian situations and so forth to make sure that education is transformative.
Thank you. Just to mention, those of you in the room are also free to ask questions. There's a microphone right up here by Joe. And if you have a question, if you can just line up there. My next question, we're balancing that. Can I give you a This comes also from our online community. How can we help children and youth to protect their future? What can we do to engage in education, especially in situations like the Syria crisis? Is there somebody who would like to answer? You have a microphone.
Yeah, I think when we think about the protection of children and youth, we can look at it from two perspectives. One is definitely ensuring that they're safe from attack and looking at the caregivers and teachers and making sure they're safe and environment. So definitely from, making sure they feel safe is one aspect. But the other is, a lot of people talk about sort of agency. A lot of what's happened in a conflict, affects their self-esteem, but also sometimes they internalize the conflict in ways that affect their sense of agency. They blame themselves, or they have beliefs and attitudes about themselves that they're somehow responsible for what's happened in their lives and to their family, and that they're sort of failing. A lot of their sense of control, this sort of unpredictable, unbelievable thing happened to them, and suddenly they feel like they're not in control of anything. So their ability to say, yes, I can learn and do something, I can walk out of my house and I'm going to be okay, is completely affected. So, I think focusing on giving them an environment that gives them that safety and predictability that, okay, it is okay, I can wake up and I know what's going to happen. But then giving them those skills, giving them back that sense of self-efficacy, that ability to plan and set a goal and realize it, the ability to kind of even think about and be aware of their self, of their emotions and how to manage them. These other skills that kind of give them a sense, how can I interact with other people in a positive way that gives me the healthy relationship, but also helps me achieve my goals. So giving them back that sense of agency is really important, given what's been affected by the conflict.
Thank you. Zane?
Just to mention something that students can do if they're not in themselves in dangerous areas. There's a student-run campaign called EMUS Campaign. It's on the website emuscampaign.org, End Military Use of Schools. And it's a way that students at the high school and university level can lend their support to protecting schools and universities from military use. If you're under 18, you have to have the permission of your parents, but it's all explained on emuscampaign.org. It's a student-run website, and it's a way that students outside of dangerous areas can also campaign to make schools safe for all students.
Thank you. I think we have a question from the audience.
Yes, building on the concept of conflict-sensitive design, do you think that areas in conflict areas that would be accepting of exposure to outside standardized curriculums such as English, Lebanese, UAE, as opposed to working in a possibly local biased curriculum?
I think that's a very interesting question, and actually, we hear that question a lot, particularly because we know that teaching and learning materials are sometimes available in other languages, and some organizations may not have experience working in the language of the students. It's a tricky issue though, because we know that children learn best when they learn in the language that they speak at home. And so I can only, in terms of our priorities and our core values, we would want to make sure that the teaching and learning materials that are used for children and young people are in a language that they can understand, but are also sort of, have the historical content of the country that they come from. Those are issues that we would really try to prioritize when we are designing and investing in education programs.
I think one tricky area is that we know that you've seen the statistic that a refugee, a person is a refugee for 17 years. And so the issue of accreditation also comes into play, that you want sort of almost like a hybrid curriculum where you're taking into consideration those language issues and content, but you really, really want to make sure that you're working with the UN and the government to make sure, or whether it's the home or country of asylum, that eventually the education that children receive is recognized and accredited. And it's so essential in what people prioritize in terms of their hope for the future, which is a key role of education. And that dialogue can take 5 years, 10 years. And so we have to kind of come together and sort of push for that recognition while immediately ensuring that kids are still in school. And it's a tricky balance when you're trying to aim for both.
We have another question.
Yeah, my question is, in your work in areas of armed conflict, I imagine there's not a lot of formal resources for education. How often do you find that the place for education is taken over or supported by sort of local religious organizations? And when they are, how do you guys decide which type of religious acts of education you support? And if you do, how do you approach that type of support?
And this is a valid question, and I think I would like to extend an answer from just the religious-based organizations to the community-based organizations, because we know that in the situations of conflict, the first respondent that come to provide education to ensure continuity is actually at the community level. It's very often the community teachers, it's very often the locally recruited leaders that come together, and very different spaces then become education spaces, either the temporary learning ones provided by the community's engagement with the different groups and networks that they have. It's an absolute priority to support those efforts. We know that the teachers are actually not paid by the government. They are absolutely supported by the communities throughout. That is a domain in which UNICEF and partner organizations are working very, very closely with at the community level.
Yeah, please.
I mean, I think I just want to add to the last two questions that basically it depends, right? I mean, these are very complex situations, and each context, we have certain values and priorities and evidence, but then we sort of have to work through the landscape, and we're making decisions, and this is the sort of adapt part of what we were talking about, of how do we get through it.
Next question.
Hi, I have kind of a specific contextual question. So you talked a little bit about how to ensure education does not contribute to worsening the conflict and education being locally based. And I have a question about when education, the nature of the education according to the conflict can be seen as innately based in the conflict. So for example, I'm thinking about Palestinian education. If you're talking about historical education, of course we're talking about American history here, they talk about Palestinian history, a huge part of this is Nakba, right? So in the cases of where their education is innately kind of the basis of the conflict, for example, Israel denies explicitly expelling Palestinians, whereas this is a large part of Palestinian history for themselves being expelled. How do you negotiate including their contextual historical education if it's seen as being kind of controversial in terms of the conflict? Is this encouraged for them to have their own historical context, historical education, even if it's controversial, or is this trying to lessen this impact?
I mean, it's very much connected to, I think the conflict-sensitive education approach is a tool that could be used to address that point, not only in the Palestine context, but every context. But maybe UNICEF has more to add to that.
I mean, you're raising obviously a very, very sensitive and relevant question. You have given the example of Israel and Palestine, but there are other contexts where very similar issues evolve. And then we know that there have been various approaches in terms of integration or segregation in the education system to both minimize the violent outbreaks, to pacify communities where needed, but also to build towards social cohesion. So some interesting examples exist in the Balkans, for example, in Macedonia, in Bosnia, where at a particular moment in history, recovering from some of the most acute violence, decisions were actually made to create 2 schools under one roof where different populations would attend school and follow different curriculum in different languages. There's been similarly attempts to bring the populations together and design a curriculum. In the case of Bosnia, for example, at some point there were 14 different ministries of education by the different sectors of the country. So there is not one straightforward answer, you should integrate or you should segregate, and there is advantages and disadvantages to both. The most extensive literature sort of knowledge that exists on these topics actually comes from the United States, from South Africa, from Northern Ireland, and each specific case is very, very rooted in the local issue. I should say that the ownership of the curriculum by the teachers and the community in which the school is located is so very, very critical. And I just don't want us to leave this room without really understanding the central role of the teacher in these processes.
I just want to highlight, I mean, that question is really at the heart of what differentiates or what's different about education as a sector versus a lot of other sectors, that it is inherently political, that is the challenge around conflict, that people are trying to push through specific values, beliefs, national identity, ideology through the content of what is taught in schools, that's sort of the biggest, easiest way to reach young people. And so that does hit the heart about this sort of, does education mitigate or exacerbate conflict, and why the sort of analysis of the context in education can often be more challenging than other sectors.
So we only have a couple minutes left. We have 2 questions, so maybe we could hear both, and then we'll try to answer before summing up.
Sure. I just wanted to ask quickly to get your thoughts on the funding process in general for aid and about streamlining it to better help with the situation with education and conflict zones. For example, my organization works in Syria. We have a number of schools right at the refugee camps, basically. If I wanted to help those educators, we would have to help that community first move the refugees, find them a stable place, rehabilitate the school, find salaries for the teachers, et cetera, and almost all of these are separate streams of funding, and it's very rare to get enough aid and development groups working on one small project to cooperate to allow that to happen. So oftentimes education in these zones especially seems to take a backseat because the amount of work that needs to go into getting that school prepared is huge, and it's just one school out of thousands. So I just wanted to know your thoughts.
Okay, and the next question.
I hope this question will kind of go along with the question of funding as to how have organizations started to adapt, or have they begun to adapt, whether in policies or anything else, to this shift from 9 years to 17 years in terms of funding, in terms of policies, in terms of emergency handbooks, for example. Has anything been done? Are you looking to do anything? And how does that coincide too, I guess, with funding?
Okay, thank you. So we have two questions very connected. First, around funding streams and the mechanisms. And then our second question is, how are we adapting to this reality that the times have changed? So we only have a couple minutes, but we'll try to do our best to answer. Is there anybody that would like to volunteer first? Yeah.
Again, another great question, and something that we like to be challenged with, actually. You know, there's been a whole sort of movement around aid effectiveness in the last 4 or 5 years, and you know, we've got Paris Declaration, you know, and donors do take that seriously. I think that we're trying to do better. You know, I can't speak for your particular situation, but I know that in this area at USAID, because we have this as one of our major goals, we are much more likely to be able to invest in education opportunities in these environments. And that's something that is different than in the past for us.
This is obviously a very challenging question, especially because education has actually dropped off the priority agenda for so many important donors, in part because education was doing slightly better than some of the other areas that are out there in terms of child survival and health, nutrition, and so forth. But I think one of the key really aspects is, again, going back to the longer term planning processes. A lot of the areas where funding is required actually are areas where long-term development programs exist, where partners, bilateral partners, international partners are engaged for 25, 30, 40 years. So apart from the obvious need of the humanitarian domain, and I've just said that we've had another drop in 2014 on that domain, we also really need to work systematically across kind of the longer term funding, and hopefully some of this work is being done. You might know that the Global Partnership for Education has made some serious efforts to support the interim education sector plans to provide some secure funding to that humanitarian context, while at the same time strengthening the education systems. There are other models that exist out there, but it is obviously a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I can really empathize as an NGO, also on the ground, trying to navigate multiple different funding streams. But I feel pretty hopeful. I mean, for me, what I'd like to see on the ground, and what I do see sort of at global levels happening more and more, even though it hasn't translated quite yet to the ground, is really just getting different actors who are engaged, whether they consider themselves or label themselves as development actors, or whether others label themselves as humanitarian or say we work in fragile, you know, to really get on the ground and try to address some of these really difficult policy barriers to helping to reach children, the sort of engagement we need with ministries of education, you know, and to see that kind of coordination on the ground. And I haven't quite seen it yet, but it's incredibly encouraging at the global level. If you sort of sit in an IE meeting, more and more actors from sort of the security sector, development sector, stabilization sector, more and more are recognizing the role education plays, whether it's in peace building or development. And so I think I'm just hoping that we can continue and take advantage of the opportunities in front of us, and that will eventually trickle down to the sort of country level.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our time. Did you have one burning point? Okay, one second.
I'm sorry, I cannot leave this room without really tackling the age question because it is so close to our heart. And I mean, we have not really had a chance to speak about the role of youth, young people in peace building processes, in contributing to social cohesion in their societies. But this is a hugely important area and an area of immense opportunity. In 2014, UNICEF has signed its new strategic plan, sort of a program that outlines the priorities for the organization, and in education specifically, we have extended our program to secondary education, which provides an immense opportunity. The demand was very much there. In terms of the 14 countries that have done the conflict analysis recently between 2012 and 13, all of them came up with youth demographic as a huge conflict factor in consideration. In terms of opportunities, we do, in some cases, the structures, the capacity that is on the ground is actually not suited very well to tailor to the needs of adolescents and youth, in terms of the skills that they need, in terms of the way we engage, participatory engagement that is required, and in terms of engaging the community. So that's really a huge opportunity. Just to give a specific example, in Liberia, the National Youth Volunteer Program that has run for the few years really has trained specifically youth volunteers in particular different sectors, education, agriculture, health, and then deployed them to schools throughout the country to strengthen really the delivery in that particular sector. Now, when the Ebola crisis came, it was those volunteers that actually were there, that were available, 250 of them were retrained on delivering sensitive messages in the communities where they were trusted. And that is huge. I mean, it shows a huge potential of young people in this context. So I hope when we take up follow-up events and things like that, we actually zoom in on this particular issue. And I'm thanking you for this question.
So to close, I'd like to thank the American Red Cross for hosting this event and for bringing us all together. Nina, Jennifer, and Dia. We look forward to interacting with you after this talk. Well, there's still some coffee and refreshments, and please visit our respective websites. We look forward to engaging with you further. Thank you very much.
And become an INE member.
Yeah, become an INE member, of course. Thank you.